morning. This is the India development debate right here on ET Now. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and straight on to the big story that we've been following like a hawk right here on this channel. And it looks like the Modi government's war against the widening current account deficit and the rupee slide may be too little and perhaps a little too late. That's the near-unanimous verdict of economists and brokerages a day after the centre hiked custom duties on 19 items, mostly consumer products. International brokerages say that the hike could bring down imports by just around $500 million, a small change compared to India's total import bill of $45 billion until June of this year. On the flip side, the hike in certain products like ATF could prove to be counterproductive, dealing a body blow to consumers right here in India, and especially domestic carriers that are already neck deep in trouble. The government, however, is putting up a brave face, says that the idea is to maintain the trade balance. Finance Ministry sources tell us that the move will make Indian-made consumers far more attractive and help Make in India prosper. On the India development debate this evening, we put the spotlight on the import duty hike, its real test and its real impact. And I'm turning across to an economist who knows more about global trade than most others that I know. Arvind Panagaria, former Vice Chairman at Niti Aayog and Professor at the Columbia University, joins us right here on the India Development Debate Direct. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Panagaria, for being with us. I think the first question has to be on the number of items, and you understand global trade. 19 items have now been put under the list where import duty has gone up. This is the nth instance of that happening. It started with the budget. Are we really turning our back on liberalization? Are we going back to the license Raj? And you have the advantage of viewing this, having been a part of the system and now more objectively from outside.
Well, Supriya, on this, my position has been pretty clear for any number of years that I've been writing on the subject, but also I think when I was within the government, that we ought not to use the tariffs for instruments, for objectives such as these. I think if current account is under a bit of a threat, the exchange rate and possibly the interest rate are the two instruments we ought to deploy. And of course, occasionally we should also use the foreign exchange reserves. So I see those three, the interest rate, exchange rate, and foreign exchange reserves are as the principal instruments of ensuring that the current account stays where we want it to stay. And as far as the custom duties are concerned, in this case, in any case, they are not going to make a huge difference. These are all on items that are small in terms of the imports. It is a signal. In fact, the tiny bit we might gain in reducing imports is offset in a big way, actually, through the negative signal that custom duties send, because it does suggest that somehow, we don't take trade liberalization seriously enough.
But Dr. Panagaria, just to be the devil's advocate, the non-oil and non-gold imports were at about $30 billion in August 2018, which is a rise of nearly 13% over last year. I mean, just to be the devil's advocate, and I kind of agree with you, this is not the most elegant way of doing global trade, having been a beneficiary of globalization. But was this perhaps a resort that was available to policymakers, given how non-oil and non-gold imports was actually rising at a significant pace, at about 13%?
See, first of all, we can't go by the monthly figures to determine the policy. The policy really, once put in place, remains there for a very, very long time to come. Tariffs once imposed are going to be very difficult to roll back. As you know, our battle against protectionism started in earnest. I think it started a little earlier, but in true spirit, it started in 1991. And it took us till about 2007-8 that we finally brought the top tariff rate down to 10%, even though there were some other peaks, some peaks like automobiles, textiles, clothing, etc., which were higher than 10%, but most duties were brought down to 10%. So it was a very long drawn battle. Now if we look at these monthly figures and then determine our trade policy based on that I don't think is a good way to make policy.
No, and that's not a very sustainable way to make policy. And you're right. I mean, these targeted goods and the import on that is roughly 86,000 crore rupees. Your CAD is likely to be 2.8% of the GDP. How much of a difference is that really going to make? But does that also bring up to the larger point that we are trying to rein in CAD? We perhaps also need to, like you mentioned earlier, need to look at financing the CAD, which is where Forex, which is where FDI, which is where ease of doing business that's being talked about so much. And all of that really kicks in. I mean, why aren't we talking about greater financing of CAD through, I mean, why is it not time that you look at larger reforms like multi-brand retail, and it will be easier to sell those reforms because you can, you can always cite the problems that we are facing with our current account deficit.
Right. No, I think we have to continue with the structural reforms. On that front, I, 100% stand with the government that the government has been undertaking structural reforms. It has not let up on those. One of my favorite ones actually was just implemented through the replacement of the MCI by a committee of eminent doctors. So I think on that front, the government is moving very steadily and very boldly, I should say. But on the trade front, somehow, we seem to have lost the plot a little bit. As I said, in the end, if it's a matter of the current account deficit, the correct instrument really is the exchange rate. And you combat it partly by using your foreign exchange reserves. So the balancing act is between how much you let the exchange rate go and how much you use your foreign exchange reserves. And that's something that, and then interest rate can be invoked as well. If really the exchange, if the foreign exchange reserves are an asset that we don't want to part with, then to some degree the interest rate could be used as well. But those are the instruments, I feel, and these are all three instruments that are in the domain of the Reserve Bank of India, which in fact has the responsibility for both the current account as well as the foreign exchange and the foreign exchange reserves and the interest rate. So this is really a matter I would rather that we leave it to the...
Dr. Panagaria, but then Dr. Panagaria, that really brings me... Right, Dr. Panagaria, then it really brings me to my other question. You make a good point that this should be done by Forex, this should be done by, the exchange rate. The government did try and rein in the rupee. I mean, those 5 policy prescriptions that were announced last weekend was all in an effort to rein in the rupee. That did not happen. So, the rupee is a function of what's happening globally. It's a function of a very strong dollar. They haven't been able to rein in the rupee despite the ECB and the masala bonds and all of that was announced. The reality is that in some way the government has taken a policy decision of sorts that they're not going to be going after Forex, which is what you have for a rainy day, and instead will encourage short-term borrowing. Are you borrowing from Peter to pay Paul in many ways?
No, you see, I still, we should also ask the question, how far do you want to rein in rupee? Should you not allow the rupee to depreciate? And the depreciation that has happened in my calculation, really, if you go back, to November 2016, the exchange rate was already about 68 rupees to the dollar. And then it had depreciated. So compared to that benchmark, the rupee has depreciated 5.5% to 6%. And that also was overdue, because if you look at the real exchange rate, given the fact that our own inflation rate is significantly higher than that of our trading partners, including even the developing country like China, which has only 2% inflation rate, then to keep our goods competitive in the global markets, it is essential for the rupee to actually depreciate. And what really we are trying to accomplish through tariffs is much better accomplished through the depreciation of the rupee, because rupee does not discriminate between this or that commodity. The exchange rate effectively reduces imports and increases exports of all commodities. It gives a level playing field to all our products, whether they're importables or they're exportables. Whereas when you use the instrument of tariff for this purpose, you're choosing that, look, I'm going to try to reduce the imports of this particular product or that particular product.
Yeah.
And so this is why, we say, economists always say that, look, it is the current account issue, deal with it using the exchange rate.
Okay. Fair fair point. But Dr. Panagariya, two quick last questions before I let you go. And one of them has to be that India has been a big votary of globalization. We've been big beneficiaries of globalization. I know technically we are still, we're still bound with the WTO rules. Technically, we have not breached the rules. We are perhaps dangerously close to. But, do we risk being seen as people who are against globalization? I mean, from a sentiment point of view, do we run that risk? And B, do we also run the risk of our own trading partners looking at retaliatory action? I mean, what stops them tomorrow from doing something similar?
Well, the second one at this point, is probably lesser a source of worry because, as you have said, these tariffs we have raised are still below our tariff bindings with the WTO. So we are fully WTO compliant and no retaliatory action, at least within the WTO rules, can be taken unless we actually violated the WTO rules, which we have not. But the first question, I think, is the more important one. And certainly, those who want to be critical of the country will then jump at it and say that, oh, look, India is turning against its commitment to liberalization. And this is not without substance. I think, the signals do matter and perceptions do matter. And we have actually, done these tariff hikes multiple times now and on a significant enough scale for people like me even to worry a bit that we are taking the wrong road in combating other objectives or in trying to achieve other objectives for which we got better instruments, which is what we ought to be using.
No, that's a very valid point. But before I let you go, as somebody who's been a very close advisor of the Prime Minister and as somebody who's been watching the India story unfold for decades now, how disappointed are you with the fact, or how concerned will you be with the fact that at Davos last year, in fact this year at Davos, the Prime Minister made a very impassioned speech embracing globalization, and he spoke about how for the solution to this worrisome situation against globalization is not isolation, and then we go back and do exactly the opposite. We can't preach the word globalization and then bring up protectionist barriers of our own, can we?
Yeah, but well, I think the Prime Minister's bureaucrats ought to listen to what the Prime Minister is saying. The Prime Minister says he's committed to open markets and all. And I personally think that, some of these changes that are happening at a bureaucratic level. And, while this Prime Minister actually does keep track of many, many things, many more things than almost any Prime Minister I can remember, at the same time, the economic landscape is so wide and so large that, it's difficult for him to keep track of every little thing that is happening in the administration. And so I really feel that here the bureaucrats ought to listen to what the Prime Minister is saying.
But Dr. Panagariya, you've been a part of the system. You've reported to the Prime Minister directly in many ways as Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog. Do you believe something like this could have passed without his blessings?
I can tell you, certainly things happen that happen against his wishes also, not just without his blessing. But I know that we from the Niti Aayog had tried very hard to privatize some of the enterprises. And for which the cabinet had actually given its blessing by passing the resolution and all. But in the end, why did that privatization not happen? It got stuck at the bureaucratic level. And I think the same for Air India. Ultimately, Prime Minister cannot decide how exactly Air India ought to be privatized. It was a decision made at the lower levels. And the decisions that got made at the lower levels ultimately led to no single buyer actually coming forward to buy Air India. So personally, I think that the bureaucrats who assist at the top level, the Prime Minister, do have a serious responsibility. But if they have different views and different training, it's not a matter of intentions. But the training is different, and that could lead to the outcomes that are contrary to the public pronouncements of the Prime Minister himself.
That's a valid point indeed. But on that note, Dr. Panagariya, thank you very, very much for joining us. You are one of the most respected voices as far as global trade is concerned. And when India does something that economists are always going to raise their eyebrows over, it's only fair we get the people who matter talk to us right here on ET Now. Thank you very much, Dr. Panagariya, for being with us. But on that note, I'm going to go plunge straight into the discussion right here. Thanks very much, sir. Let's go straight into the debate right here. And joining us on the show this evening, Professor Rupa Chanda, RBI Chair Professor in Economics at the the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, former economist IMF. I've also got Mr. R. Gopalan, former Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs and also India's former Finance Secretary. Sanjay Budhia, MD Patent Group, and also somebody who heads CII's Export Council, and Dr. Rajat Kathuria, Director and CEO at ICRIER. So thanks each one of you for being with us. And Professor Rupa Chanda, 19 items is where the duty has been increased. This is yet another instance where the government has gone ahead and done that. First it was for textile, before that it was in the budget. Are we going back to the license Raj era? Are we turning our backs on liberalization, something that has served us well all this while?
Well, definitely we seem to be giving signals that we want to go back to an era where we want to encourage domestic manufacturing, substitute for imports, and use the typical export import sort of lens to address the current account deficit when the problem lies somewhere else. So it's not a good signal as far as market sentiment is concerned and what sort of signal we are giving about our stance on globalization. But having said that, it's just 19 items. It's a very small proportion of our imports, and the impact on the current account deficit is likely to be very limited. Of course, it will vary a bit across the sectors, because in some cases it will depend upon the elasticity of the imports, and that may not affect the volume of imports too much. In some cases already some of the companies were sourcing domestically, so to that extent maybe there wouldn't be too much of a dent. And again, in some cases there could be an effect on the export side as well, because there are some imports like of precious stones and so on which would have an impact on the gems and jewelry exports. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So as I would say, the impact is not great, but the signal is not very good, because we are repeatedly doing this since last year. And then the budget, and let me also answer it in a different way. That what is the signal we are trying to give as far as the rupee is concerned? What we are trying to do is saying that we are trying to address the current account deficit to arrest the slide in the rupee. This follows on the various measures that were recently taken with regard to the capital account. But on this also I have my doubts. Are we really going to be able in the long term, given that there are structural issues with our trade basket in terms of export competitiveness, as well as the external factors that are actually causing the slide in the rupee, the volatility that's happening, say because of the strengthening
Professor Chanda,
of the dollar,
please let me come in there. Yes.
On oil prices, etc.
Professor Chanda, I'm sorry, I'll just have to butt in there. I just request all of you to keep your answers brief, because I have a lot of ground to cover. You make a very important point there on the signal that we are sending. Let me get in Mr. Sanjay Budhia, who's joining us from Kolkata. And Mr. Budhia, the signal is that India is raising trade barriers. You are somebody who's got, your skin in the game as far as India's export-import is concerned. Is that the right signal to send? And, it would have perhaps been a right signal had this had a significant impact. You look at report after report from Nomura, from Morgan Stanley, from Bank of America. This is going to have a very minimal impact. 0.1% of total imports is all that it's going to cover. I mean, this is not significant to our finances. This psychological solution that we're trying to look for, isn't this going to do more harm than good? Mr. Budhia.
I look at it from different angles. We have to first agree and understand that local has become global. Indian companies have become multinational, and we have world-class quality, most competitive prices. And the Make in India scheme, Startup India scheme, definitely those schemes are coming into force. We have to go with the global headwinds and change with the changing times. We see the trade war going between US and China. There would be a tendency for the Chinese company to send materials, I'm not saying dump materials, into India, which is a big, huge market. So whatever we are doing, which are under WTO compliance and WTO compliant, I think there is nothing wrong for taking those steps for the time being, and nothing is permanent. These could be temporary measures, but that sends signals that we are with the domestic companies, and domestic companies are really world class companies in terms of quality. I am particularly myself in exports, and wherever you talk about Indian quality, you are respected as much as any other company from anywhere in the world. So I think we should not get it into total negative perception that it will send wrong signals. All the countries, wherever required, whenever required, they take proactive actions, they take reactive actions, and I think we should look today's action also into the same lane.
Mr. Budhia, okay, Mr. Budhia, that's a very different side of the argument that you're making, and that's obviously an argument because you benefit from a move like that. So I appreciate the fact that you're making, because that's the other side of the story, which obviously sometimes gets missed out. But Dr. Kathuria and Mr. Gopalan, I want to come to both of you on rupee and CAD. And Mr. Gopalan, let me begin with you. We give government little credit, and I include myself in that. But the move has been largely aimed at resurrecting the rupee, reining in CAD and all of that. The question that a lot of people are asking is that can you at all rein in the rupee, and should you be reining in the rupee at all? The rupee had significantly appreciated. Should you be reining the rupee at all, because the real effective exchange rate is still not at a level where it becomes worrisome?
Able to hear.
Mr. Gopalan? Could Mr. Gopalan hear me?
Yeah, I just didn't. Yeah, now I'm able to hear you. What I would suggest now is that looking at the real effective exchange rate as a guide for depreciation to take place in an orderly manner is a good thing to do. I'm not against it. And what RBI can do at times is to ensure that this movement is without volatility. It is in a position to manage it in a manner that it doesn't affect, it doesn't bring in the volatility. But once again, there are external factors which are going to really operate, like for instance the increasing the interest rates in US, the oil prices which are there, which are going up, and OVL today says it's going to hit $100 soon. So these are some of the external effects, and your Argentina, Turkey and those kind of problems which are coming up, that is going to be an unsettling external environment which you will be having. I am not sure whether this is the right time to take these kind of steps, because the whatever $13 billion which you are aiming at this point in time, it is very, very small number. So my view is that we should be focusing on competitiveness of our exports or the infrastructure and making things easy for doing business, and also focus on those sectors where you have relative competitiveness like pharmaceuticals and those kind of things, and try and push them as fast as we can. And that is a better way at this point in time to have the international community to understand that well, we are taking real structural steps to improve our exports, and therefore the confidence will get built. That I think will be the correct thing to do at this point in time.
Fair point. But Dr. Kathuria, let me come to you. This is a largely incremental move in terms of the limited impact it's going to have. Many people believe this is not the most elegant way of doing global trade. The difference will be about 86,000 crore rupees on a CAD that's likely to be 2.8%. Should the focus instead be on financing of the current account deficit? Whether it's FDI, whether it's multi-brand retail, good time to open that. We are dependent far too much on FII inflows, which are in any case fickle. I mean, does the attention need to shift away from just trying to rein in the CAD to financing the current account deficit? Because the debate sometimes gets lost between reining in the rupee and curbing the CAD. We don't talk about this aspect enough. Dr. Kathuria.
No, absolutely. I agree with you, Supriya, that the attention on reining in the current account deficit today to shore up the value of the rupee, I think it's a move which is incremental, which is short term, and unlikely to have the impact, even in the medium term, because it depends upon really what the elasticity of those imports are. And the kind of signal that you send out by doing this action, by taking this action, is that I wouldn't go as far as saying that India is becoming as protectionist as it was, but the signal that is sent out is that we are also one of those, if not anti-globalizers, but we are looking at protecting our domestic market at a time when I think we should really be the votaries of globalization. India is at its point in its sort of economic history and structural transformation where it needs globalization much more, I think, than the countries before us that have benefited from globalization, like China and Korea. Unfortunately, at this time, the world is becoming closed. And if the world is becoming protectionist and we also send signals that we are inclined to become protectionist when we actually need the global markets much more than they do, then I think it doesn't augur well for India in the future. So what we should be doing really is to improving the structural conditions to operate in the domestic market. In fact, exactly the opposite. If you are to become a part of the global or regional supply chains, if you are to integrate South Asia, if you have to integrate Southeast Asia, then I think you have to allow people to set up businesses in India, and those businesses can actually be set up with a more effective tariff regime. More sort of more
Dr. Kathuria, let me come in there. Dr. Kathuria, may I please come in there?
And just
okay.
Sure. Okay, yes.
Just one second, Dr. Kathuria, I'll come back to you. Mr. Budhia, the point that Dr. Kathuria is making is an important point. And the point is that we can't be telling the world globalization and then go ahead and do something opposite. You are right in saying that exports are going to benefit out of this. But for us, our commitments to WTO are being met on a technical basis. WTO cannot take any action against us because our rates are still going to be under the bound rates, so to say. Technically, we're still WTO compliant. But are we joining a camp of companies, countries, which are looking inwards? Can we say yes to an insular world? Mr. Budhia.
I think I totally agree with all the esteemed colleagues and the panelists. India is on top of the list of the countries who are talking about globalization and in the global value chain. So there is no reason, and there should not be any reason which sends wrong signals, and I don't think that today's action should be taken in that connection on a longer term basis. As I said earlier, we might have to be reactive, we might have to take certain actions for some time, but when we talk about export competitiveness and import restriction, I think we should not look in isolation. It should not be either or we cannot do either. We have to increase our export competitiveness. Absolutely right what everybody has said, and also the structural reforms. Also, I would like to touch upon the point of rupee volatility, which everybody has talked about. I think all of us remember the kind of volatility what we had, and I remember very distinctly that it had gone from one level to another where there was a huge difference, and people in Tirupur and Cuttack, they had to make derivative losers association because there was no. So I think rupee has to be in a range. It cannot just whether we want to make it range bound or whatever is to be done, we should have certainty. And I would also like to add one more point. There is a perception that rupee depreciation helps exports, but I think there should be some kind of understanding that rupee depreciation necessarily does not help exports. I would give you an example. Say if you are exporting goods
on that
worth
note,
100
sir,
rupees,
I'm sorry, I'll have to cut you short there.
Which is your cost.
Sir, on that note, I will have to cut you short there. I will take this across to Professor Rupa Chanda. And Professor Chanda, for financial year 14, our exports were growing at 17.2%. That fell to 11.6% in fiscal year 18, which is the lowest it has been since fiscal year 2004. At a time when we need to boost exports, do our decisions, the ones that we have taken on import, run the risk of disrupting our trade ties? Arvind Panagaria was with us and he said, it's not a big worry right now, retaliatory tariffs. But are you someone who shares the concern? Do you believe otherwise? Could retaliatory tariffs or trade barriers become a reality for India?
No, I'm not too concerned about the retaliatory part of it, because as long as we are WTO compliant, I don't think there is such a fear. But the issue really is that imports do feed into exports. And if this kind of resorting to import duty hikes continues, it could actually eventually affect the cost competitiveness of some of the exporting firms as well. We need to recognize those linkages. What we really have to look at is the long-term structural issues which are affecting our export competitiveness. I mean, we've talked about innovation, we've talked about poor connectivity, logistics costs. I mean, there are just a slew of things that need to be done to improve export competitiveness. So that should be the focus. To arrest the current account deficit, the focus has to shift towards improving export capacity, towards diversifying our export basket, to make them less import dependent if possible, because many of our high export items are highly import intensive. And that's actually an interesting point, because when we talk about exchange rate depreciation, helping our exports, it's a bit of a mixed thing, because it really depends. In some sectors, your import costs rise as a result of depreciation, and they don't necessarily foster export competitiveness. So it's not a clear-cut case. Plus, where you have a lot of supply side constraints, a lot of infrastructural bottlenecks and skilling issues, etc., your ability to expand export volumes due to a rupee depreciation doesn't just happen. So there is a lot of inelasticity in export supply as well. So therefore, the argument that's often made that exchange rate depreciation, that the rupee has been overvalued, that's correct. It needs a steady sort of depreciation. We need to manage it. But whether that's going to help improve the trade balance, it's not such a clear-cut case in the case of India,
right,
because of the structural
is a debatable issue.
We have.
Okay, on
but
that
that
note, I'll
doesn't
take a
mean
really quick breather, Professor.
Export competitiveness.
And that's the right thing to do. It's going to take a while, but that's where the trade debate needs to go to. Increase exports, try and diversify your export basket, and of course curtail imports. Give me a moment, I'll take a really quick breather, then I come back and put the spotlight on consumption. Is this really going to affect the rich? Does it really matter? With Mr. Gopalan and Dr. Kathuria right here. So give me a minute. I'm back in just a moment right here on the India development debate. Good to be back with you once again on the India development debate, and I think it's time to shift the focus on this entire import duty debate to you, the consumer, as well. And I think it's only fair that I begin with you, Dr. Kathuria, because consumer spending generally picks up before festive season. That's one of the things that has been said against this move. Will this decision impact our consumer demand? And the reason why I ask you that question is because consumption has really been the mainstay as far as our own growth story is concerned.
No, absolutely. Our growth, often people say that our growth is, in the current environment, is going, instead of on two engines, we are on a one engine, which is led by consumption. I'm not sure of how this will impact the prices in the marketplace. They're likely, this is festive season, and what's happened since liberalization started in 1991 is that there's a lot of competition in the sectors where the tariffs have been hiked. So if you look at the white goods, the air conditioners, the washing machines, etc., where you do see the tariff hike that have happened. The tariff hikes are not very large; they're about 5%, 10%. But we're not sure how this is going to play out in the market. Yes, there will be a pressure to increase prices because import prices have gone up. But at the same time, given that it's festive season, given that there's some amount of competition in some sectors, enormous amounts of competition in the market, and given that all these companies would be vying for the consumer purse, it is likely that some of the companies would, in the short term, tend to absorb whatever price pressures they feel on the input side to take advantage of the increased demand in the domestic market due to the festive season. So I think it's going to be a combination of these two factors. I wouldn't worry too much about the impact on prices as I would worry about the long-term signals that this is sending out. And one important thing is that, we all say that this hike in customs duty, it's WTO compliant and it's likely to be short-term. But, rolling back duties is a big ask. It takes a long time. The political economy gets established around, tariff increases, and therefore to kind of unwind that would also take some doing and some, political will to undo that.
Fair point. Mr. Gopalan, let me come to you. This other point that's being made is that prices will go up. But is this an exercise in futility on that count? Because people who can afford to buy diamonds and imported jewelry and imported refrigerators and air conditioners over domestic ones, they're not going to care about a 7 or 10% hike in prices. I mean, they can shell out, I'm sure, a few extra thousands. That's not going to make a difference to their lives. So is this whole argument of prices will go up, consumption, but is that also misplaced?
Well, I want to answer another point made by Rupa, which is very important, is the our import intensity of our exports, which has been going up for quite some time, and therefore a depreciation is not really going to help to that extent as one would imagine that would in increasing our exports. On the question you have just raised is on the question of consumption. Now, you know that the cash and cash equivalent available with the public has really gone up. Now, the reason why that has happened is because there is some amount of uncertainty in the minds of the public about what is going to be the state of the economy with all the external factors and other things which are happening, elections coming in. So, with all this in mind and with the prices going up, will the consumers be in a position to buy these kind of goods during the festive season as much as have done in the past is a question to be watched. And I am also looking at the rural economy, how the rural economy is going to take shape thanks to the agricultural produce and the price which they are going to get. Are they going to get enough income from the produce they are having, where the government will be in a position to buy those things, enable the income of the farmers to be stabilized. So, those are factors that are going to be taken into account that will determine to some extent how the increased prices are going to become, transform into the market, the buying and those kind of things as we go along. I agree with Rajat that a small increase in price is not going to be a great matter of disturbance for the consumers, but all these factors will be taken into account by the consumers before they decide to go in for festive season purchase.
And that's again a sentimental impact, is it not? But Mr. Budhia, I think I need to ask you a question, because you're the lone supporter of this move of sorts, but isn't it surprising for, say, and I'm going to get down to specifics right now, a hike in ATF from 0 to 5%, is it non-essential? On one hand, the government wants more and more Indians to fly. You have this Udan scheme and you're saying flying is cheaper than, now taking trains. Does this send out a signal that there is confused, if I may say, disconnected policy move in New Delhi? On one count, you're trying to woo people to fly more. On the other, you're hiking ATF at a time when a lot of the aviation companies are in any case in the red. They are facing a lot of turbulence, a lot of trouble. Mr. Budhia?
Yeah, I think, on this point even, I have also some mixed feelings that it's really not going to serve a great purpose by raising the ATF. And when more and more people, more and more airlines, and when we want people to go to the each nook and corner of this one particular thing, I am not really too very happy about this, what has happened. So, I agree with others that on this I am very, very clear that how this step is going to help, that I am not very clear.
Okay, I think another thing that I will get Mr. Gopalan to answer and then move forward, sir, is a lot of people, at least on online and social media and otherwise, have raised questions and have criticized the government for imposing import duty, not imposing import duty on gold. But you've been in the finance ministry and you believe that this could be counterproductive since it can fuel smuggling. Do you share my view on this, or are you someone who believes that by not doing so, you're actually incentivizing buying of more gold, and today the gold import is not hurting you so much. Next month it might begin to do so.
Okay, on gold there is always a competition between smuggling and orderly import. Now, this calibration, the finance ministry knows how to do that, and whether the import duty can be raised to the extent smuggling can not take place is an exercise which finance ministry knows, and if they are in a position to look into it, they will be in a position to do that. I am sure, it's possible, it can be done. I still feel there is some slack left there which can be used by the government. This is one. Second, on all the imports on which the duties have been imposed, raised at this point in time, if they come through the FTA countries, they escape this thing, especially from the ASEAN countries. The duty rates are so low on our FTAs. Possibly this increase in duties will not be applicable to FTA countries. So I don't know how much of it is going to be helpful in increasing the prices of these commodities in the country. But gold is something which needs to be, but most importantly, Supriya, electronic components and electronic items which are coming into this country have really, surpassed any imagination. And what are we going to do to ensure that that is produced in this country, to ensure that the requirement is taken care of, but at the same time imports are not resorted to. I have got a number of items, there machinery, electrical machinery is there, and coal which has increased imports is coming into. There are a lot of item by item one should go into and see how domestically we can tackle all those to ensure that the imports in future do not increase.
I think you raise a very important point on, No, I think you raise a very important point on electronic items and their imports, and which is exactly the question that I was planning to ask Professor Rupa Chanda. This move has been justified, saying that this will boost local manufacturing and this is going to help Make in India take off in a bigger way. But imports of electronic goods tell you a different story. 40 billion in fiscal year 17, 50 billion in fiscal year 18. This obviously implicates that Make in India hasn't taken off. We started with a lot of expectations, but now nobody is talking about this. Why can we not make some of these things here? How do you incentivize that? Because if the move is aimed at making it possible in India to be made here, our numbers are not telling us that. And is this going to enable Make in India? Is this going to enable domestic manufacturing at all to take off?
See, Make in India is an initiative. The problem is it doesn't have a sort of strategy or an action plan behind it. So what you need is, instead of just putting 25 sectors out there of various sorts, you need a much more focused and targeted approach to individual sectors where you think there is a lot of scope to improve exports. Then you need to identify markets, you need to look at the barriers in particular markets, you need to look at the domestic issues. For instance, standards are a very important issue today. So how much do we meet the sort of standards required in international markets? Do you have the skill sets? So what I'm saying is that just an import duty hike here and there is not going to lead to import substitution and increase in domestic manufacturing capacity. What you need to do is provide the entire ecosystem. You have to bring in FDI, which then sources domestically. What is Make in India for? Is it for generating employment? Is it for becoming an export hub for the world? Well, if it is for becoming an export hub, then you have to look at how do you tie your SMEs into the global value chain? How do you link them to the lead firms? So there has to be a complete strategic sort of action plan which is currently missing in Make in India. So I'm not surprised that it hasn't taken off. So it's the whole set of things on doing business, reforms, logistics, etc. What I mentioned earlier, all that has to be tackled for you to actually have Make in India be a successful initiative.
Fair point. Mr. Budhia, you want to add to that comment? Because this comment is an important comment on Make in India. I'll just request you to keep it brief, because the rationale given is that this is going to boost domestic manufacturing. This is going to give a bigger fillip to Make in India. Is this the way to go forward, or do you need certain more enabling factors to perhaps make here?
I totally agree what has been said, that we need to have multiple and multi-pronged approach, and in today's papers only we have seen the Commerce Minister is taking a meeting on the first, exactly on the same issues, how to increase India's exports to 400 billion in the next few years, and whatever issues on individual sectors. that is what is the need of the hour, and whatever constraints, whatever need to be tackled on short term, medium term, and how to go about it. I think we are on the right track. We need to increase exports, and we need to tackle the low hanging fruits, because there are certain things which can be tackled and which can be done on an immediate basis, and the Commerce Ministry is reviewing it with the individual export promotion councils, with the trade commodity bodies, and industry associations like CII, FICCI and SOCHM. So I totally agree with what I.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think
you make an important point there. I'm going to go across the table. Okay, I'll go across the table and get a quick last word from the other three panelists. And if I may start with you, Mr. Gopalan, instead of getting US to waive off our sanctions on the oil that we import from Iran, are we wasting our time, energy, effort, and a significant amount of, negotiating tools that we could have had elsewhere?
Can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you properly.
I'm just saying, instead of exhausting our options with the US to waive off the Iran sanctions, are we wasting time, energy and effort in more futile options like increasing import barriers?
Well, look, energy security is very important, and for getting crude from various sources is very important aspect. Well, Iran is one good source, cheap fuel, a longer period of payment, and we should not miss it. I think we should keep trying and looking at alternate ways in which we can make payment to Iran crude. But there are other issues I want to point out in this debate, which is getting kind of missed on the electronic components and electrical goods. You see, you have got to have, we are importing electronic components in a very, very big way. We are not competitive like China or Taiwan or Korea. So why not we be in a position to make those, fabs in this country from polysilicon and then make the chips? And then, there was an attempt to do it in the last, 10 years, but nothing has materialized. Why not we look into that? That is going to be in a position to ensure that electronic components imports are reduced to a great extent. So, and look at, clusters, how to develop clusters, standards which Rupa has just now mentioned, and inverted duty structure correction has to be done, which is very, very important. And if the surge in imports take place, we should get into WTO compatible QRs and safeguards, which we need to do to ensure that when surges take place, we are able to do.
Mr. Gopalan, I'm sorry, I'll have to cut you short there. I'm really running out of time on the show. Yes, Mr. Gopalan, I'm sorry, but I'll have to cut you short there. I'm really running out of time on the show, and which is why I'm sorry there. I am really running out of time on the show. But Dr. Kathuria, we'll let you have a quick last word on the show. When Mr. Modi was in Davos earlier this year, and I happened to be in the audience listening to him, he spoke against forces of protectionism raising their heads against globalization. He also said that such tendencies can be considered lesser risk, no lesser risk than terrorism or climate change. What is he going to tell his audience at Davos if he were to go next year? And have we been pulled into the temptation of threatening multilateral trade order given how US and China are behaving?
I missed that question, Supriya. Can you quickly repeat that question?
Sure. I said when Mr. Modi was in Davos last year, he very eloquently said, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
When Mr. Modi was in Davos last year, he said forces of protectionism are raising their heads against globalization and such tendencies were very dangerous. What is he going to tell his audience if he were to go to Davos next year? And have we given into the temptation of being pulled into forces that are threatening multilateral trade systems like a US, like China?
Well, I think it's too early to say that whether this duty hike will actually scale up and protectionism will actually scale up. I think we will soon realize that India at a stage in development today needs global markets much more. So it's in our interest to become much more pro-global and sort of international flow, multilateral. And I think we've always been supporters of multilateralism. I don't think there is a fear of what he would say in Davos next year. I don't think this is, unless this gets scaled up to a level where India truly becomes anti-global. So I think this is incremental, as you had said earlier in the program. But I just want to make an important point that Mr. Gopalan made about the electronics industry and how we can actually benefit from liberalizing our electronics industry, which is that if you really want the Make in India in electronics to take off, one of the things that is missing, all that we do today, more often than not, is assembly of imported products from Korea, from Japan, from China, and that's what we're doing. And maybe that is the way to, move up the value chain. But I think the one missing component in Make in India in the electronics sector is a semiconductor industry and a printed circuit board industry. Once we get the semiconductor industry, there will be significant spillovers in the electronics industry, not only to serve the domestic market, but also to serve the global market. So we should focus on getting
I think that's a valid point that Mr. Gopalan made. Okay, I'm sorry. I think that's a valid point Mr. Gopalan made. I'm glad you carried forward this. It's been a fascinating discussion, and thank you each one of you. You've been subject matter experts. Some of you've got your skin in the game, and thank you for pointing out what are the problems with this, what else could the government do, what is the way forward, how do we plug the current account deficit without having to resort to ideas and issues that is going to make us appear protectionist and increasingly insular in a world which should ideally embrace globalization. But thank you very, very much, Mr. Gopalan, Professor Rupa Chanda, Dr. Rajat Katuria, and of course, Mr. Sanjay Budhia for being with us in this edition of the India Development Debate.